Before I start, I just want to say that over the weekend, the channel broke 1,000 subscribers, and I just want to thank you all for your support over the past 2.5 years to get to this point. This brew is for you. Cheers. This is a Treehouse style IPA that I brewed at home, and at 8% ABV, it is dangerously crushable. So let's go back a few weeks to when this whole process started to see how I made it. Now, Hazy Double IPAs may be one of the most popular styles in craft beer right now, but if you want to make it at home, it can be a very challenging style to brew, let alone master. There are several key factors to nailing the style, and the first one we'll talk about is water chemistry. Typical water profile for this style is where the chloride to sulfite ratio is somewhere about 2:1, and this higher chloride concentration will enhance the malt, the sweetness, and the body of the beer, and the lower sulfite concentration will decrease the perceived bitterness, especially coming from the hops. The way I'm going to accomplish this is by having about 200 parts per million chloride and 115 parts per million sulfate. And the actual amounts for this batch are going to be listed on the screen as well as down in the description. Now, for the yeast, there's so many options, and the recommended yeast strain that Treehouse said in their video was to use London Ale 3. So when I went to my local homebrew store, they only had Yeast 1318 as that same strain. This yeast brand has a smack pack inside to give the yeast a head start. It needs to be activated 3 hours prior to pitching, so I'm going to do that right at the start of my brew day. Now, for the mash temperature, the style is typically on the higher end, so I'm going to aim for 152 to 154 degrees Fahrenheit to get a sweeter and fuller-bodied beer. To get that haze that is a part of this craze, I'll need oats. And following the recipe exactly, I have 10% flaked oats, then 85% two-row, and 5% cure foam for a little bit of head retention. This will give the final beer that nice, hazy, golden orange color, and really will let the hops be the star of the show. Once my water is up to temp, I'm going to add in my brew bag and begin mixing in my grains to prevent any dough balls. And for the brew in the bag method, I like to double crush my grains, excluding the oats, of course. If you're not going to do a brew in the bag, it's a good idea to add in rice hulls at this point, so you won't get a stuck sparge, as oats can cause that issue. I'll let this mash for 45 minutes and come back about every 10 minutes to give it a stir to ensure uniform heating in my mash because I don't have a way to recirculate it. Then I increase the temperature to heat up the mash to 168 for a mash out for 10 minutes. Then I began slowly draining into my second kettle and sparging over the top using a brew spoon and electric tea kettle. Once all the wort was sparged, I placed it back in my gigawort for the boil. And once it was up to a good healthy boil, this is when I add my first hop addition of Magnesium, aiming for around 20 IBUs. With about 20 minutes left, I added 5 IBUs worth of Citra, Simcoe, and Amarillo, and at the end of the boil, I add the same amount by weight as that 20-minute addition. I'm going to ferment in a keg under pressure to ensure that no oxygen will get into this beer, as it would be detrimental due to the massive dry hopping I'm going to add later. I get about 2.5 gallons of wort after the boil. I give it a quick shake to aerate it. Then I pitch the entire package of London Ale 3, which you know is working when it fully puffs up at the end of the day, before cutting into it. Now for the dry hops. I'm going to add the recommended amount, which is 5 grams per liter of each Citra, Amarillo, and Simcoe, but I'm going to place them inside a muslin bag with a sous vide magnet inside. I will say that this method worked, but I'm not sure I got the best contact once it was dropped into the beer with nearly 5 ounces of hops inside this bag, but it did definitely contribute to the final beer. Now once all the hops are inside, I tied it off and I'm going to attach the second magnet to the lid of the keg and carefully place it inside and seal it up. If you do this method, make sure to never move the keg or the fermenter once it's in place, as it could make the magnets dislodge and drop the hops in too early. Now for the original gravity, I was aiming for 1070, but because of that slow sparge, I actually got an increase in efficiency that I normally get, giving me an original gravity of 1080. Checking in 24 hours later, the pressure had started to build up inside the keg. It was actually coming in at about 12 psi. I'm going to dial it back a little bit to release the pressure down to 10 psi, and the byproduct of that is getting in a wonderful aroma blast of Citra hops. Fermenting under pressure helps keep the volatile aroma compounds from the hops in the beer, and then I let the beer ferment away for 5 days. On the 5th day, I took a sample to determine if the beer had reached its terminal gravity, and I'm looking for something around 1019. And I also want to taste a sample of the beer to see how it's progressing, prior to adding all the dry hops that I'm about to do. At this point, it was actually pretty underwhelming. It had little to no hop character and was very sweet and unbalanced, which is not what I was expecting based on this recipe. After the sample had lost its carbonation, I was able to get a gravity reading using my graduated cylinder by placing the hydrometer inside, and I got 1020, which means this beer comes in at 7.8% ABV, and the yeast has reached 74% attenuation, meaning the main fermentation has finished. So at this point, all I had to do was dry hop, so I just released the magnet from the top of the keg, and then the plan was to let it sit on those hops for 3 to 7 days. If your fermenter can, Treehouse recommends dropping out the yeast before dry hopping, but as I'm fermenting in a keg, it doesn't allow for that. So after 3 days, my curiosity got the better of me, and I had to sneak a sample of the beer to see how it's progressing. And oh man, did it smell fan-freaking-tastic. It reminded me of fresh cut papaya, so based on that, I decided to let it sit for 2 more days, so 5 total. And after that 5th day, I cold crashed it by placing it in my garage, which was around 44 degrees Fahrenheit, for 24 hours, basically overnight. Then I pressure transferred into my serving keg and set the serving PSI to around 10, and here's the final resulting beer. Right off the bat, you get that signature golden or orange haze with a long lingering head. The aroma reminds me of candied orange with a little bit of citrus, but the fresh papaya is actually gone at this point, which is kind of surprising. I do think that adding this quantity of hops using a magnet in a muslin bag did not lead to the highest impact on the final beer aroma, but if you have another way to dry hop without exposing the oxygen, give that a try to get the maximum contact of the hops with the beer. Now, as I mentioned before, this beer is dangerously drinkable at nearly 8%, and it has a soft, round, velvety mouthfeel and finishes with a nice, lovely bitterness. I think that bitterness came 100% from the dry hopping because it wasn't there after day 5 of fermentation. I do think that this beer will not last very long on draft as it's so tasty. Now, for improvements on this great recipe, I personally think it could use a little bit more bitterness coming from the kettle hops, and it would be nice to try splitting the dry hopping schedule, so adding 2.5 grams per liter at peak Krausen and the second half of that 2.5 grams per liter after it reached terminal gravity like it did in this batch. Also, there's a ton of alternative yeast strains out there for this style, and I know yeast plays a major factor in the final beer, so it'd definitely be interesting to try different strains besides the London Ale 3. Overall, I will say I'm very happy with how this beer turned out, but it gives me a lot of ideas how to tweak this recipe, and that's not even mentioning all the different hop combinations that exist out there to see how it would change the final beer. So let me know what has been your best New England IPA recipe, and if you're looking for another homebrew recipe, check out the video on the screen right now, and I'll see you again soon.